A thin rain clung to the windshield as the truck idled at the edge of the subdivision, engine pulsing with a low, steady growl. Arjun sat behind the wheel, hands resting at 10 and 2, staring at the quiet line of identical houses across the street. For 12 years, his life had been measured in miles, fuel stops, and sunrise deliveries. The road gave him structure. Home was supposed to give him rest. Lately, it had been giving him something else. Uncertainty. Inside the house, Mira moved from room to room with a quiet urgency he did not recognize. She used to meet him at the door when he packed for trips, teasing him about forgetting his gloves or overloading the coffee maker. This morning, she stayed in the bedroom. The door had been closed. That was new. He told himself it meant nothing. People changed, schedules shifted. Still, his phone showed 3 missed calls from her the night before, all made in a tight cluster after midnight. When he had called back, she had answered on the 3rd ring, breathless, explaining she had been asleep. Arjun had not asked why someone asleep would call 3 times. He rolled his shoulders once, a habit before every long haul, and climbed down from the cab. Inside, the house smelled faintly of disinfectant. The kitchen counters gleamed, almost stripped bare. Mira stood at the sink, back to him, scrubbing a mug that already looked clean. "You're leaving early," she said without turning. Dispatch moved the run-up. He waited for more. None came. They stood in that thin quiet that had been growing between them for weeks, fragile and loud at the same time. She picked up her phone. The screen lit her face. She angled it away from him on instinct. The movement was small. It landed hard. In the bedroom, his duffel lay open on the bed. As he folded shirts, he noticed the closet door was shut. It hadn't been last night. He did not open it. Instead, he reached into the side pocket of his bag and felt the small, hard rectangle he had bought 2 days earlier, a Wi-Fi camera no larger than his palm. He had told himself it was for security. Package thefts, Bray. Kins, a lie that had sounded responsible when he paid for it. The truth sat heavier. He waited until Mira stepped into the shower. The water-covered sound. Arjun moved quickly, methodical in the way the road had trained him to be. He cleared a narrow space behind the row of travel books on the living room shelf. He angled the lens toward the front door and the hallway. A faint red point blinked alive. He hesitated, finger hovering over the power switch, then pressed it. When he zipped the bag shut, his hands were unsteady. Mira emerged with wet hair, robe tied tight. "Drive safe," she said, still not meeting his eyes. At the door, he turned as if to say something that might have stopped everything. Instead, he nodded. The truck pulled away as the neighborhood shrank in his mirrors, roofs flattening into geometry. Miles later, long after the last familiar exit slipped behind him, a silent device inside his living room detected motion. The front door shifted, the lens steadied, and the small red light kept watching as Arjun's life on the highway carried him farther from whatever was about to step into frame. The camera did not know doubt or love or fear. It only recorded movement and shadow and quiet decisions being made beyond its lens. By the second hour on the interstate, the rhythm of traffic stopped soothing Arjun's nerves. White lane markers slid beneath the cab like a metronome he could no longer synchronize with. Every vibration of the engine carried the same question in his chest. What was happening inside the house now that he had left it behind? He checked the dashboard clock too often, recalculating delivery times he already knew by memory. Night fell slowly, then all at once, swallowing the road in a wide black stretch, broken only by reflectors and distant headlights. Each glance at his silent phone tightened something behind his ribs. Mira texted just after dusk, "Everything fine, drive safe." The words felt arranged, as if they had been selected from a drawer of polite phrases. He typed back 3 different replies and deleted each one before sending a simple heart emoji he immediately regretted. At the first truck stop, He parked between two reefers humming in opposing keys. Diesel stung the air. Inside the diner, he picked at eggs that tasted faintly of metal and burned coffee. Around him, other drivers talked about routes and weather. None of them spoke about the feeling that something had shifted at home. Sometime after midnight, a storm rolled across the plains without warning. Rain drummed against the cab so hard it drowned out the radio. Arjun pulled onto the shoulder and watched water streak across the glass in crooked paths. In that suspended moment, he imagined the small red light in his living room blinking in the dark, patient and blind. Morning came pale and slow. With it, messages from Mira resumed, brief and functional. Picked up groceries. Busy today. No questions about his route, no mention of missing him. The emotional shorthand that had once passed between them felt replaced by curt transaction. He tried calling once. It rang until voicemail. 30 minutes later, she sent a single line, "Can't talk right now," no reason offered, no promise to call later. He placed the phone face down on the dash, but his eyes kept drifting toward it, as if the screen might light on its own and explain everything. Back in the house he could not see, the camera recorded ordinary life as if mocking his fear. Mira crossed the living room in sweatpants and socks. She vacuumed. She watered the plant by the window. At one point she paused in the hallway, checking her reflection in the dark screen of the television. Nothing about her movements suggested urgency, yet nothing felt natural. At 2:37 in the afternoon, the camera logged a new notification. Motion detected. The timestamp cut cleanly through Arjun's thoughts while he waited at a way station in Oklahoma. He did not see the alert until an hour later. By then, whatever had happened was already finished. When he finally pulled over that evening, curiosity overpowered caution. He opened the app with trembling fingers. The video buffer crept forward in increments. First, the quiet living room, the muted afternoon light. Then Mira entered through the front door, her posture different from the morning, shoulders drawn tight. She did not remove her shoes right away. She turned back toward the open doorway as if listening for something beyond the camera's range. The seconds stretched, then the air in the frame shifted. A shadow crossed the threshold first, slow and deliberate, followed by the unmistakable outline of another person stepping inside. Arjun stared, breath locked in his chest, waiting for the image to clarify itself. The camera shook slightly as if disturbed by passing air. The figure remained half in shadow, face hidden, body angled away from the lens. The clip continued to play without sound, without explanation, without mercy. Whatever had just entered his home was someone she had been expecting. The screen froze on the moment before the stranger stepped fully into view at last. Arjun waited until the truck stop settled into its late night lull before opening the app. Engines idled like distant breathing around him. Fluorescent light leaked through the windshield. His hands trembled as the loading circle spun, each second stretching as if the file itself resisted being seen in that moment. The clip opened on the familiar frame of his living room. Afternoon light lay flat across the carpet. Mira stood near the door, one hand still on the handle, her posture tense. Arjun leaned closer to the screen, as if proximity might soften what followed. His breathing turned shallow suddenly. A figure moved into view behind her, stepping with casual certainty. The stranger's face turned toward the camera for a brief, devastating second. Arjun recognized him instantly, recognition arriving faster than thought. The neighbor, the one who waved at him on garbage mornings across the quiet street they shared together. Mira did not recoil or freeze. She stepped forward and closed the distance between them as if guided by instinct. Her hands slid around his waist, his arms circled her shoulders. They stood that way without urgency, without secrecy, as if the walls themselves were accustomed to their bodies now. Arjun felt something rupture behind his eyes that was not quite tears. The embrace ended only when Mira tilted her head toward the hallway. The neighbor followed without hesitation. Together they disappeared past the camera's edge, leaving only an empty doorway and the echo of movement he could not hear. He dragged the timeline backward and watched it again, then once more. He studied details that made no difference, the way his own couch caught the light, the way Mira's hair shifted against the window glow. Each replay carved the scene deeper into him until it felt permanent and alive. A message from Mira arrived while the video looped. Long day, going to bed early. The text hovered over the image of her leading another man toward their bedroom. Arjun did not reply. He set the phone down on the passenger seat as if it were suddenly dangerous to touch. Sleep never came. Every time he closed his eyes, the frame restarted. Her hands, the hallway, the shadow where the camera could no longer see. By morning, the betrayal felt less like discovery and more like occupation, a presence that filled the cab with second hand ere he could not escape. He stopped at a rest area just past the state line as dawn spread thin color across the clouds. In the bathroom mirror, his face looked older, the eyes hollowed by a night of silent witnessing. He splashed water on his skin as though the footage might wash away clean. Back in the cab, he opened the app one last time. He copied nothing. He saved nothing. He only stared at the frozen frame of the doorway where the two of them had vanished. His thumb hovered over the menu icon, trembling with a decision he already understood was forming. Deleting the file felt like plunging his hand into fire. Confirmation prompts stacked on the screen, each one asking if he was certain. He said yes with his thumb again and again, as if obedience could unmake what had already been seen inside his mind where it burned brightest still. When the image vanished, relief did not follow. The living room returned to blank quiet, just sunlight and carpet and waiting shadows. Arjun disconnected the device remotely, watching the red dot fade to gray on his screen. He told himself the story had ended there because he needed it too. He drove the rest of the day in a numb straight line, skipping meals and ignoring dispatch calls. The road unfurled endlessly, but his world had narrowed to a tunnel between what he knew and what he had erased. By evening, one thought rose above all others he had to. He needed to see the house again with his own eyes, not through pixels, not through shadows. The answer, whatever it was now, waited behind that door. As he turned the truck toward home, he had no idea the next time he entered his street, it would be into silence. Arjun reached the edge of his neighborhood just after noon, the sun high and unforgiving. He did not call ahead. The truck rolled to a stop 2 blocks from his house, far enough that its presence would not announce him. The decision felt automatic, as if made by something colder than thought. He stepped down from the cab, the heat pressing into him, and started walking toward the life he no longer recognized. The front door opened on the first turn of the lock. Inside, the house held the stale quiet of a space recently used and quickly abandoned. Shoes sat by the mat, not in Mira's careful line. In the living room, the shelf where the camera had been hidden stood ordinary and empty, proof that it had been there only in memory now. From the hallway came the faint sound of movement, soft and unguarded. Arjun moved down the hall without calling her name. The bedroom door was ajar. Inside, Mira stood near the dresser and turned in sudden shock. For a second, neither spoke. The words that might have bridged the moment collapsed under the weight of what he had seen. Her mouth opened to form his name, but the sound arrived too late. The gun was in the drawer where it had always been, a relic inherited and mostly forgotten. His hand found it without ceremony, guided by momentum rather than planning. What followed happened in a single, fractured instant. A sharp sound split the room. The moment after widened into stunned silence as Mira fell, the force of the moment stealing all motion from her body and from him alike. Arjun stood frozen, breath shallow, the room altered beyond recognition, though nothing physical had changed except one terrible finality. He waited for something that would undo what had just occurred. Nothing came. The quiet pressed in. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower droned distantly, absurd and indifferent. The weight of consequence settled heavily, yet instead of stopping him, it pushed him forward. He left the house without locking the door, crossing the street as if pulled by a cord he could not cut. The neighbor's garage was partially open, the interior dim against the bright afternoon. Tools lay scattered on a workbench. The man from the video stood inside, absorbed in his own small task, unaware that the quiet had already been shattered behind him. The afternoon light cut sharply across concrete. When the neighbor turned, surprise reached his face first. There was no time for questions, no exchange that could slow what followed. Another sharp report tore through the enclosed space. The man collapsed against the bench and slid to the floor, motionless. The sound of falling tools rang briefly, then faded, leaving the garage wrapped in stunned stillness. Arjun lowered the weapon and set it down near the wall, as if distance could lessen its meaning. Outside, the street remained calm, blinds drawn, sprinklers ticking, no witnesses appearing. The neighborhood absorbed what had happened with frightening ease. He stepped away from the open garage, crossed the street again, and did not look back at either house. The truck welcomed him with familiar vibrations as he climbed into the cab. His hands moved on habit alone, the engine engaged. He pulled from the curb and followed the route back toward the main road as though still on schedule. With each turn, the street behind him unraveled into memory, replaced by asphalt and the long, empty stretch of highway ahead. By the time the first neighbor would notice the open garage and call for help, Arjun was already miles away, hidden among other freight haulers under the same darkening sky. 2 houses behind him held unnatural quiet. And as the first sirens began to rise in the distance, the road carried the killer steadily outward into waiting darkness. Sirens reached the block before most neighbors understood what they were hearing. Red and blue light spilled across trimmed lawns and quiet windows, transforming the street into something unrecognizable. Officers moved first to the open garage, voices low, movements precise. Within minutes, the scene hardened into protocol, tape stretched, radios crackled. A body lay just beyond the threshold, still enough to announce that this was no longer a medical call, but a crime. Across the street, another unit approached the unlocked front door of Arjun's house. No answer came to their knock. Inside, they found a second silence waiting. The bedroom held the unmistakable signs of a violent interruption. A life stopped mid-breath. Detectives exchanged a look that needed no translation. 2 scenes, 1 street. The question shifted instantly from what happened to why here and why now. By early evening, the neighborhood had become a grid of controlled movement. Officers moved door to door, collecting fragments of sound and shadow from startled residents. Most reported nothing clearly, a bang that could have been construction, a figure crossing the street they assumed was a neighbor. Ordinary explanations offered for extraordinary outcomes. It was the doorbell cameras that gave the first clean thread. One camera captured Arjun's approach to the garage with a purpose that erased coincidence. The timestamp aligned with the estimated window of the second death. Another camera recorded the empty street minutes later as he walked back alone. The footage played in the dim light of a patrol car like a confession without sound. Somewhere between those frames, a decision had completed itself. Inside the house, a forensic team worked around the stillness with practiced care. In the living room, a small Wi-Fi camera sat, detached from its power source behind a row of books. Technicians documented it before attempting recovery. The device yielded no usable local footage, but its mere presence reshaped the narrative. This had not been a blind eruption. Someone had wanted to see. Ballistics tightened the circle. A revolver recovered from the garage matched the fatal wounds in both victims with mechanical certainty. The weapon's serial number traced back years to a registration in Arjun's family. The path of ownership had ended with him. What had looked like spontaneous rage began to reveal structure, preparation layered beneath emotion. Financial analysts joined before midnight. Bank activity showed unusual withdrawals over several weeks, small enough to avoid alarms but steady in rhythm. Phone records added their own quiet testimony, encrypted messages, contact names disguised as numbers, gaps where ordinary conversation should have lived. Each digital absence carried its own weight. The investigation was no longer searching for a single violent moment, but for the shape of a hidden life. Then came the truck. Dispatch confirmed Arjun had left on a scheduled haul days earlier and had not formally returned. Patrol units queried highway cameras while a transportation compliance officer accessed his electronic logging device. The system that measured every mile of his working life began to yield its story in clean data lines and precise timestamps. Most of the log read as expected: departure, highway speed, mandatory rest. Then the pattern broke. A 2-hour span showed only blank entries, a recorded absence where movement should have been. The blackout sat exactly over the estimated time of both deaths. Not a signal failure, not weather, a manual interruption inserted with intention. By the time detectives linked the GPS gap to the doorbell footage and the recovered weapon, the street had emptied of onlookers and filled with quiet judgment. What remained was coordination. Alerts went out across state lines with a description, a plate, a face. Somewhere on the highway, a freight truck moved through the dark, carrying both distance and the narrowing edges of pursuit. By dawn, the street was empty again, but the investigation widened instead of settling. In a chilled server room 3 states away, a technician logged into the cloud account tied to the disabled camera and began pulling fragments the device's owner believed he had destroyed. Deleted did not mean gone, it meant scattered. Thumbnails surfaced first, low resolution and silent, each stamped with a time Arjun could not outrun, already cataloged beneath case numbers, quiet squares that promised context without mercy or commentary at all. One still showed Mira at the door, fingers curled around the handle in mid-decision. Another captured the neighbor entering with familiarity that needed no rehearsal. In the final usable frame, her shoulder angled toward the hallway he now knew too well. There was no audio, no proof of what followed, yet the sequence formed a bridge no defense could later burn. Time-coded betrayal had weight, and it pressed down through every layer of the case with a gravity that bent even seasoned investigators. Financial records began speaking in the same clipped language of inevitability. Small transfers moved from a joint account into digital wallets that did not carry Arjun's name. The amounts were modest in isolation, unremarkable even, but their rhythm was persuasive. Every 2 weeks, sometimes weekly, always followed by corresponding withdrawals from an automated teller miles from the suburb. Someone had been stockpiling quiet exits long before violence made haste unavoidable. Encrypted exchanges accompanied the money, threads of intent braided through timestamps no one could deny. Messages extracted from devices filled with the blunt economy of secrecy, names replaced by symbols, addresses masked as coordinates. The neighbor's number appeared where friendship should not exist, blooming inside message chains that bent around work schedules and night hours. A pattern emerged that transformed suspicion into architecture. This had not been an accident of emotion, but a sustained collaboration of risk, reward, and manipulation that reached well beyond an open door and a waiting shadow, anchored by promise of control that rarely leaves witnesses. Detectives mapped the digital threads over the physical, withdrawal locations plotted beside traffic cameras, message bursts layered against dispatch logs. Each overlap tightened the circumference around Arjun's final free hours. The 2-hour GPS black out no longer floated as a lone anomaly, but as the absence that allowed every other piece to align. By subtracting his movement, the data described his intention with chilling clarity. What emotion could not prove, correlation now carried with unarguable precision, a geometry of guilt drawn in light and silence. Across jurisdictions, requests hardened into warrants. Banking compliance officers returned calls within minutes instead of days. Cell providers yielded mirrored logs kept beyond the reach of consumer deletion. Even the truck's internal systems surrendered cached location pings at the edges of the blackout like faint footprints at the lip of erased time. Each artifact removed another refuge where doubt might hide, until denial itself seemed to have nowhere left to stand. All that remained was the moving body that had created the trail now closing. Coordination moved from conference lines to radios. A description circulated with mechanical comm, tractor type, trailer markings, plate digits that narrowed the world to a handful of exits. Highway patrol units spaced themselves along corridors dictated by freight logic, not instinct. Somewhere between way stations and wind, bent signs, a single vehicle carried a man who still believed distance could behave like forgiveness. The alerts hummed along fiber and air alike, invisible hands tightening around routes he took for granted every working day of his life. Late that night, a patrol unit pulled off beneath a sodium lamp at an otherwise forgotten rest area. The glow washed over rows of parked rigs like a stage that had finally been lit. The listed plate appeared exactly where probability said it would not. Officers did not rush. They watched exhaust drift, watched the cab's dark window, watched the quiet patience of an engine that had not yet learned it was finished running. In the cab, Arjun sat unmoving, breath measured, unaware his margins. He had parked among strangers for safety the way he always had, trusting anonymity and routine more than any lock. The phone lay beside him, screen dim, its silence mistaken for mercy. He did not see the vehicles easing into position at the edges of the lot, did not register the slow choreography forming around him in mirrored glass and steady boots outside his door. Every system he had trusted to measure distance had now completed its quiet work of return, placing reality precisely where a dispatcher's voice murmured through a radio half a mile away. Troopers adjusted vests and cams with economical gestures. The lot felt suspended, a held breath between motion and consequence. When the lead unit rolled forward at last, headlights sweeping toward the parked tractor, the moment stretched thin as wire. By the time Arjun looked up at the sudden white glare flooding his cab, the road had already finished with him, metal and authority advancing together, closing the distance he once thought was infinite tonight. The headlights stayed fixed on the cab as if pinning it to the earth. Arjun opened the door slowly, hands already visible before the command fully left the loudspeaker. He climbed down the steps with the careful balance of someone descending into cold water, not shock, not fear, just the heavy weight of arrival. Troopers moved in practiced angles, weapons drawn but steady. When the cuffs closed around his wrists, he did not resist. His face showed no protest at all, only the strange calm of a man who had already left. In the back of the cruiser, Arjun stared forward without scanning the mirrors. The dashboard camera recorded a posture too still for innocence, too composed for surprise. At the processing center, his belongings were laid out in quiet rows: wallet, keys, phone, the small paper log he still carried out of habit. Each item became evidence the moment it touched metal. When asked if he understood why he was under arrest, he nodded once. Yes, he said softly. That single word settled heavier than any denial could. The first interrogation room was windowless and white, a place built for time to stretch. Detectives entered without urgency, laying the foundation with questions that required him to repeat known truths. His name, his route, the times he last spoke to his wife, he answered everything with steady precision, as if reciting instructions he had reviewed alone for days. But when the footage stills slid across the table, something shifted, not in his posture, but in the speed of his breathing. He said he returned home early because of a mechanical issue. The camera data placed him there hours before any report to dispatch. He said he confronted only one person. The ballistics showed two identical ballistic signatures across the street. He said he shut off the camera in panic. The cloud logs revealed automated deletions attempted 2 minutes before the killings. Each answer narrowed into a contradiction that left no room for accident. Silence lengthened between questions like measured distances on a map he could not escape. Forensic results arrived while they spoke. The revolver tested clean for function, but not for history. Microscopic blood traces lifted from the grip matched both victims in separate layered patterns, not overlap but sequence. On Arjun's jacket, analysts found a fine misting consistent with clo, range discharge in 2 locations. Gunshot residue on his cuffs aligned with the time window of the GPS blackout. Even the carpet fibers embedded in his boots linked him physically to both doorways he had crossed that afternoon. When the evidence was read aloud, Arjun's eyes closed once, slow and deliberate. He did not collapse, did not cry, did not argue. "I didn't plan the second," he said, finally departing from prepared language. "It followed me." The detectives did not correct him. They let the sentence hang where it belonged, suspended between confession and self-protection. That single fracture in his story would later become the line prosecutors would widen into certainty before 12 strangers. News of the arrest moved faster than the transport that carried him to county holding. Before dawn, local stations carried the still image of his face pulled from his commercial license database. By morning, the street he had left behind appeared again on screens, now layered with police tape and speculation. Neighbors learned the word premeditation in real time. The driver who waved from his cab had become a figure built of data points, angles, and red boxes drawn on maps. By afternoon, prosecutors assembled in a narrow conference room, stacked with files that had multiplied overnight. They reviewed the footage fragments, the financial transfers, the verified deletion attempts, the weapon match, the streetwide camera grid. Each category alone suggested intent. Together, they formed a closed shape with no exit. The lead prosecutor spoke little, listening, marking pages. When the briefing ended, she stood and said only that charging documents would be filed before sunset. Arjun was moved again, this time into a holding cell that smelled of metal and disinfectant. Through the narrow slit of reinforced glass, he watched officers walk past carrying stacks of labeled evidence bags with his name printed in repeating black ink. A public defender introduced himself briefly, his voice careful and practiced. Arjun asked only one question in return: how long before court? The answer came with a pause built to soften what could not be softened at all. By early evening, the announcement went out. The district attorney stepped before microphones and spoke in measured, unwavering language. Based on the evidence presented, the state would pursue full prosecution. 2 counts, premeditation, digital corroboration, no room for bail. When she finished, the word that mattered hung clean and unavoidable in the air. Life imprisonment. The sentence existed now even before the verdict did, already casting its long shadow toward the courtroom where the truth would be forced fully into light. The courtroom felt smaller than it looked on television, compressed by breath and consequence. Arjun sat at the defense table in a borrowed suit that fit poorly at the shoulders, hands folded as if still restrained by memory even without the cuffs. Behind him, rows of strangers filled with quiet expectations, faces drawn by gravity rather than curiosity. When the judge entered, the room rose as one body and settled again into silence conditioned by law and fear. The prosecutor did not begin with rage or betrayal, but with sequence. She spoke of miles logged, timestamps preserved, routine converted into evidence by its own consistency. She framed the case as a journey that began long before the afternoon of blood, shaped by knowing choices and maintained deception. Each sentence pressed deliberate weight into the ledger of the trial, positioning the jury not as witnesses to tragedy, but as auditors of intention. The first footage appeared without sound, projected in fragments that left no space for imagination to hide. Mira's hand hesitated on the door, the neighbor's shadow crossed the threshold, and familiarity displaced doubt in a silent exchange that needed no commentary. The final frame froze on absence, not bodies, not violence, but the knowledge that whatever followed was no accident of misunderstanding. The courtroom did not move as the screen went dark again. Next came the logbook of distance, a digital record stripped of romance and speculation. An analyst explained how the hall should have unfolded and where the record had been intentionally broken. The 2-hour blackout glowed on the screen like a wound that refused to close. Routes that had once defined Arjun's working life were redrawn as proof of opportunity, control, and calculated return. Time itself converted into a witness that could not be intimidated. Forensic testimony stripped away any final refuge of doubt. A technician explained blood spatter not as horror but as physics, droplets mapped in arcs that proved proximity and sequence. Microscopic fibers tied boots to carpets and jacket cuffs to discharge. 2 separate lives were traced through particles so small they could not be seen without machines, yet heavy enough to carry the full narrative of how both deaths unfolded within minutes of each other. The money followed. An accountant walked the jury through charts that resembled quiet heartbeat patterns of deception. Transfers small enough to avoid alarm, steady enough to build escape. Encrypted wallets mirrored withdrawals, and purpose concealed inside arithmetic. The financial motive did not replace emotion, it weaponized it. What the hidden camera revealed as betrayal, the money exposed as preparation, a parallel life constructed one controlled transaction at a time. The defense rose with a voice softened by sorrow rather than argument. They spoke of emotional collapse, of a man fractured by discovery, overwhelmed by confrontation, undone by humiliation that arrived too quickly for reason to survive. They described a moment of rage expanded by shock into catastrophe, urging the jury to see chaos where the state saw design. Their language leaned on empathy, offering collapse as the only honest explanation for what the evidence described too cleanly. Cross-examination dismantled that shelter with patient precision. The prosecutor returned to the 2 hours the defendant himself had erased, the automated deletion commands, the staged timing that required forethought rather than panic. She asked why money had been moved weeks before discovery, why routes had quietly shifted, why 2 separate confrontations occurred with only measured distance between them. The answers did not arrive. Silence became the defense's final argument, and it failed without having to speak. Deliberation took less time than the victim's final moments. When the jury returned, the foreperson's hands trembled only once before steadying on the paper. The words "guilty on all counts" moved through the room with a sound heavier than any gavel strike. Arjun closed his eyes again, not in surprise this time, but in acknowledgement, as if the verdict had merely caught up with something already finished inside him. The judge spoke last, voice restrained by ritual and weight. 2 lives taken with deliberation, digital evidence, and deliberate concealment. No mitigating collapse, no mercy carved from circumstances that had been engineered rather than endured. The sentence followed without ornament, life imprisonment twice spoken for clarity, no return, no horizon beyond walls and measured days. What began with a hidden camera ended in a courtroom so quiet that even finality felt loud. Prison processed Arjun the way it processed everyone else, by removing every remaining illusion of relevance. The clothing he arrived in was folded, labeled, and locked away as property he would likely never reclaim in use. His hair was trimmed without ceremony, his name replaced by a number that traveled faster through the system than identity ever could. Steel doors closed behind him in stages, each one subtracting sound, distance, and the version of himself that once believed motion could always outrun consequence. The cell was narrower than the cab of his truck, a refinement of space reduced into final dimensions. He learned quickly how the day would move, counts, meals, lights, silence. Nothing traveled far here, not even thoughts. At night, he lay awake listening to the rhythm of other men breathing trapped in concrete persuasion. The highway he once trusted as escape now returned only in memory, an endless black ribbon that led nowhere at all. Across the city, the house did not recover the way living things do. The garage was cleaned, the bedroom repaired, the walls repainted, yet absence resisted renovation. Mira's family moved through the space like cautious visitors to a disaster exhibit, whose artifacts refused to lose their weight. After a time, the house was sold below market value to buyers who never asked why the neighborhood still lowered its voice after sunset. Fresh furniture arrived, but the quiet remained. The neighbor's name vanished faster from public thought, reduced to a footnote beneath heavier headlines. His family relocated within weeks, chased not by threat, but by the unbearable geometry of recognition. No distance could soften the outline of his role in what followed, yet distance was all they had left to spend. Addresses changed, phone numbers followed. History remained perfectly reachable from any search bar. The camera that had begun everything was boxed and logged, then buried deep in a climate-controlled evidence archive where decay was engineered never to arrive. Technicians had long since finished extracting all that could be extracted from it. What remained was a black shell no longer capable of watching, its silent lens reduced to an artifact of beginning rather than proof of ending. It would never again record movement. It had already captured too much. Media interest faded in the reliable way it always does, not with resolution, but with substitution. New crimes found new stages. New faces replaced the old. Yet in the online archives, the story hardened into pattern and warning, replayed by strangers who scanned it not for lessons, but for the sharp taste of shock that required no participation. The comments slowed. The file remained. Years passed. Arjun aged inside routines that refused to adapt to him. He took a job in the prison workshop where measured repetition replaced measured miles. Wood became shaped beneath his hands the way distance once had beneath his wheels. At night he wrote letters he never mailed, filling pages with precise retellings of choices, as if accounting could still negotiate with outcome. None of what he wrote changed anything outside the cell. It only altered the order in which memory returned. Once each year, a review board briefly reopened his name as administrative ritual rather than real possibility. He learned how to sit without hope, how to answer without asking. Each denial folded another year into permanence without surprise. Even disappointment eventually becomes a known temperature. What remained was endurance, thin and constant as he waited for days to finish doing what days always do. In the suburb, children who never learned the streets old story rode bicycles past the repaired homes with laughing carelessness. New owners planted hedges where police once stood. Trivia replaced tragedy as time redistributed attention the way it always does. Yet older residents still paused at dusk when engines passed too slowly, producing a reflex built from echoes that no longer existed in sound, only in the body. The highway continued without memory. Freight moved with indifferent momentum through weather and light and hour. Trucks passed the long stretch of interstate rest stop where an ending once overtook a man who trusted distance too deeply. The sodium lamp still flickered. No marker named what had happened beneath its corrosion-colored glow. The road kept what the road never bothers to remember. In the end, nothing miraculous grew out of what had been exposed. Truth did not heal, it only finalized. The hidden camera had not saved anyone. It had merely prevented erasure. It proved what happened. It did not undo it. What remained after the silence was not justice in the emotional sense, nor closure as stories promise, but a permanent alignment between cause and consequence that no one involved could ever rearrange again.